exterminate some enemies and try to control that region. So arguably, according to this definition, the U.S. presence does not include combat activities at all. From a truth perspective, this definition is true. I have not seen a definition of presence that actually goes the opposite of this. I've not seen any evidence to support a counterinterpretation, and every qualified definition of military presence that I've read on the topic says that combat operations are not presence activities, which means it does probably exclude a fair amount of Iraq and Afghanistan affirmatives, even though there are Iraq and Afghanistan affirmatives that go beyond particular combat missions. So, for example, the U.S. does a lot of things in Afghanistan with its military. It involves a lot of training of the Afghan local military. It involves police keeping in the city, in the capital of Afghanistan. It involves counter-drug operations. All of those probably fall under the concept of military presence. But the actual combat mission of Afghanistan, the part of the topic that probably most people were voting for because they wanted to eliminate combat activities in Iraq and Afghanistan, arguably is not topical. Now, that's not going to prevent teams from reading AFs that withdraw combat forces from Iraq and Afghanistan, but it is going to make them, in my opinion, very open to a challenge of topicality. What does this definition include? It's an extensive list, and in fact, in a footnote, this particular author makes that list even broader. I would list a variety of activities. I would say the vast majority of these activities that I'm about to list that include fall under the rubric of U.S. presence are probably supported by the consensus view of people who define and write about presence. That these things, in my opinion, are unquestionably topical and are unquestionably examples of U.S. military presence. And on the other hand, some of these things will probably lose the topicality regardless. But I would say presence includes the training of foreign militaries, which is a huge part of what we do in Iraq and Afghanistan. And in fact, there's a woman named Catherine Lutz, who is one of the major solvency advocates on the topic. She wrote a book in 2008 that was basically about why we should eliminate U.S. military bases. And she says that U.S. presence is predominantly now about the training of foreign militaries because the U.S.'s way of engaging in the world militarily is about reducing its actual footprint of its military because the military footprint is really expensive. Like, it's really expensive to have a large military base. So she says that the wave of the future and probably most U.S. presence missions are just about training foreign forces and so that the U.S. can reduce its actual troop deployments that are deployed in particular countries. Actions to improve the interoperability of U.S. and foreign forces. Interoperability means that the forces work well together. It is a term of art. You need to know that term because there will probably be some affirmatives that talk about it next year. But basically, if the U.S. and NATO, for example, Turkey, which is a member of NATO as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, if Turkey was ever attacked and the U.S. came to the defense of Turkey, in order to fight well in a conflict together, they have to be able to use the same equipment. They have to be able to use the same communications frequencies. They have to train together and so forth. So interoperability is basically military procedures that allow the U.S. military to work with allied militaries. It is part of the reason why we conduct joint exercises with other militaries. It is a large part of the reason why we do training with militaries and we do military exchanges with U.S. and South Korean officers. They might come to the U.S., the U.S. might go to South Korea. The reason for that is to promote the goal of interoperability so that we can work well with our allied countries in the event of a crisis. They say that a third purpose of presence is to peacefully and demonstrate U.S. commitment, which means the stationing of U.S. forces. So the act of stationing forces in a country is unquestionably part of U.S. military presence. If you remember the definition, he kind of explicitly says not all stationed forces are presence, but that presence is a mission of the majority of U.S. stationed forces in a particular country. The reason why we have a lot of troops in South Korea, for example, is not really because we think that there's going to be a war between North Korea and South Korea, and the U.S. would need its army to fight off the North Koreans. The North Korean military is really bad, and the South Korean military alone could probably clean their clock. But the reality is that we have those troops stationed there because, not because those troops are going to be vital to winning the war. We only have like 30,000 troops in South Korea. North Korea has an army that's like 800,000 people. Those troops would probably be killed if it came to just a sheer numbers contest. The reason we have them there is they function as a tripwire to, in the event of hostilities, the U.S. has told South Korea that it will get involved in a particular conflict, that it might take all of the forces from the U.S. and annihilate North Korea if there was a war that was ever going to occur between those two countries. The forces we have there themselves are not probably good enough to engage in the conflict. They function as a tripwire to draw in greater U.S. forces. And you need to also know that term. Tripwire is a term of art that you should definitely write down. It just means that we have a small amount of forces that, if there was a war, it would draw in a larger amount of forces from the U.S. A fourth component of presence is to gain intelligence. And in fact, a lot of people, even on the left, accuse the U.S. of having motives of just trying to surveil the global population, basically. A lot of the reason we have bases all over the world is so that we can interact with foreign militaries, but also form as contacts to interact with local intelligence services so that we can get greater information about the world. A fifth purpose is to conduct peacekeeping. Peacekeeping means that there are no actual hostilities, but that it's an unstable situation so that war could break out in the future. So peacekeeping is highly relevant for both Iraq and Afghanistan. Yes, we have a combat mission in both countries, but there are parts of those countries that are relatively stable, and some people describe the activities of the military in places like Baghdad, where there aren't open conflict, as primarily a peacekeeping function, that there are insurgents, they occasionally mount terrorist attacks and so forth, but the existence of U.S. forces serves to stabilize that particular area. So there's a large portion of our mission to Iraq and Afghanistan involves peacekeeping activities. And the last thing that he mentions is the pre-positioning of U.S. assets. And the term pre-positioning is also another term you should write down. It is a term of art that you need to know what it means. It means that we station equipment in a particular country so that if there is a crisis or hostilities that break out in the future, then we can use that equipment because it's right there. We don't have to send a lot of equipment from the continental United States because we already have equipment within the region. And this is actually a huge component of the articles about military presence. Another term that you need to know that's related to this is the term logistics, which you should write down. Logistics just means the practice of planning the movement and maintenance of U.S. forces. A lot of the topic countries involve support for logistics. So, for example, Kuwait and Turkey, we have a relatively large force in Kuwait and a much smaller force in Turkey. But both of those forces operate as logistics centers for the rest of the Middle East, and where they have pre-positioned equipment